items supposedly resistant to change. Whereas the repertoire, quote, enacts embodied memory, performances, gestures, orality, dance, singing, in short, all those actions usually thought of as ephemeral, non-reproducible knowledge. Taylor argues that the repertoire, quote, keeps and transforms choreographies of meaning, and that the repertoire as an analytical tool allows scholars to trace traditions and influences of different embodied practices across time and space. Taylor's conceptualizations are cornerstones of contemporary performance theory, but are rarely rigorously applied to sport. One of my aims here is to demonstrate the immensely generative application of her terminology to sport and physical culture. So while archival knowledge undoubtedly informs the transmission of knowledge in physical cultures, the repertoire is integral to the transmission of knowledge in sport. Indeed, most sport participants learn by using their bodies, and these participants frequently rely on bodies of parents, teachers, coaches, and peers to transmit knowledge person to person. The history of sport, however, is frequently constructed using the contents of the archive, such as policies, published books, photographs, and newspaper articles. There has, of course, been a movement to incorporate elements of embodied experience through oral histories or techniques of ethnography and autoethnography in the last 20 years. Frequently, these emphases focus on anecdotes and personal memories that add emotional depth to historical events. It is less common, however, that the details of embodied practice receive explicit focus. This is, of course, completely logical. As my anecdote at the beginning of this paper suggests, the details of embodied knowledge aren't translated all that well to textual forms. It does, however, leave a significant gap in the tracing of embodied knowledges and the construction of sport histories. In the case of basketball, for example, it is relatively easy to find out information about policy and rule developments. It is much more difficult, however, to trace the development of specifics of embodied practice. This is where the Margaret Eaton archive is an invaluable resource. While the documents contained within it are necessarily archival, many of them speak to the repertoire, and more specifically, personal items such as class notes illuminate embodied practices of women in specific historical moments. This not only provides key insights about these practices, it also offers opportunities to trace the development and genealogies of them. To demonstrate, I will focus on the items pertaining to the women's basketball archive. Some context about women's basketball sort of helps situate these. Basketball was invented in 1891 by Dr. James Naismith at a YMCA in Springfield, Massachusetts, and women began playing as early as 1892. Influenced by sociocultural attitudes towards women and their bodies at the turn of the 20th century, educators sought to sanitize the game for women, and educators Senda Berenson and Clara Gregory Blair were widely credited with introducing modified rules for the women's basketball game. Berenson's modified rules included dividing the playing space into 3 sections, increasing the number of players on the court, and eliminating contact entirely. In 1900, Nora Cleary, an educator in Ontario, introduced basketball in Canada. As Patricia Bertinsky and Anne Hall note, these rules influenced the uneven development of women's basketball across our country. More specifically, there was a general division between East and West, where in the West, from Manitoba to British Columbia, women tended to use the men's rules, whereas in the East, women tended to use the modified rules. And it wasn't until the early 1960s that the rules became standardized across the country. There is a fairly healthy body of work that examines the development of basketball in the United States. There is, perhaps unsurprisingly, considerably less work that examines the development of the game in Canada. In combination with the uneven application of the rules in different locations, this creates a significant gap in tracing embodied practices and knowledge of women's basketball in Canada. The folders pertaining to basketball in the Margaret Eaton archive illuminate the practice of basketball in Ontario in the late 1930s, helping to speak to one of these gaps. Though there are several entries on basketball in the archive, here I primarily focus on class notes by Lois Crichton, class of 1942, and Phoebe Hamilton, class of 1939, found in folders 178A and 187B respectively. I focus on 3 contributions these contents make to the study of women's basketball history in Canada. So the first contribution of the Margaret Eaton archive materials is that they add granular detail to existing research on embodied transmission of basketball stills. Indeed, both Crichton and Hamilton's class notes provide lengthy descriptions of everything from general defensive strategy to officiating on shooting techniques. So you can sort of see some of those notes here. Each of these entries offers a unique, offers a unique vantage point for studying the transmission of embodied knowledge at a hugely granular level. For example, Lois Crichton's notes offer a step-by-step breakdown of shooting technique. So, and then I summarize it so we can actually see what that is. So it's a 16-step breakdown that begins with holding the ball almost directly on its sides, easier to guide. Some players have hands too far back, throws off direction, and ends every shot should be a good one, or you should know the reason why, which sounds like pretty much every coach that's ever taught me how to shoot basketball. Chest shots are frequently described in basketball manuals and textbooks from the 1930s and 1940s. For example, in Basketball for Girls, a book written by Wilhelmine Meisner and Elizabeth Meyer and published in 1940, the authors described several different shooting techniques, because there were several techniques. Basketball shooting hadn't been standardized at this point. Significantly, however, they do not describe the two-hand push shot in detail. Rather, they refer readers to a step-by-step breakdown of a two-hand chest pass. Surely, there had to be a difference between passing the basketball and shooting it at a rim above your head. Creighton's step-by-step breakdown of the push shot then adds granular detail to the descriptions of those like Basketball for Girls and other physical education textbooks, and offers key insights into points of emphasis of the shot in Ontario, specifically in the late 1930s. Insights that are now hard to gain as that generation progressively dies out, for lack of a better term. Performance studies scholar Diana Taylor and Joseph Roach suggest that memories and tensions are also embedded in the repertoire. Taylor writes, quote, "Performance makes visible that which is always already there. The ghosts, the tropes, the scenarios that structure our individual and collective lives." And the second contribution of the materials from the archive is that they offer insights into the development and attitudes toward different skills. For example, of the 16 points regarding the two-hand push shot, 2 focus on jumping, and more specifically, on avoiding jumping. The wording of the notes is significant here, as the notes suggest it is poor form to jump, but not strictly against the rules. The emphasis of Crichton's notes suggests the teacher's emphasis in teaching this particular performance skill. Of course, a little conjecture is at work here, but it seems fair to suggest that jumping after shooting was a widespread enough issue that it merited the teacher emphasizing that we shouldn't jump after we shoot. This both reveals a key moment of transition in shooting technique in modified role basketball played in Ontario, and captures one of the inherent tensions in the repertoire of women's basketball. Women were and are at once expected to execute specialized physical skills and to maintain a level of female decorum while doing so. In another skill area, it's the lack of emphasis on comportment that is striking. In their notes on offensive strategy, both Crichton and Hamilton describe screens or picks, where an offensive player without the ball impedes the path of a defensive player. Keeping in mind at this time there wouldn't have been contact, you would have just been physically between the player and the ball. The use of screens and picks was an emerging offensive strategy in both the men's and women's basketball at this time. In the early 21st century, screens have specific footwork and arm position to protect the screening player from contact. Interestingly, there's no indication of the specifics of screening in these notes, which suggests sort of a gestation moment in screening technique. Unlike the notes on shooting, the notes on screening are significant because they reveal a tension between cultural attitudes towards women and physicality and embodied practice in Canada. Neither sets of notes suggest the possibility of women committing a blocking foul, in which one player makes physical contact with another. This differs sharply from several of the basketball books and articles written about women and basketball at the time. This suggests that while the transmission of women's basketball practice sometimes reiterated anxieties about women's comportment and behaviors, as was the case with the two-hand push shot, there were also disconnects between official manuals and textbooks and what was happening on the ground. This speaks to the significance of personal items such as class notes for the writing of women's sport history in Canada, as the notes offer an insider perspective of the transmission of embodied skills, a perspective that is progressively difficult to gain, as I said before. The third contribution the archival materials make to the study of women's basketball is that they provide insights into the complex genealogies of concepts and embodied practices and suggest areas for future research. My first example is more out of my own personal curiosity than anything else, but in Crichton's notes, she provides a key to explain her notation for the basketball plays, and there are several relatively complicated plays. There's even the emergence of like a screen the screener as one of the out of bounds plays, which I always argue is everybody from age 5 until you finish playing runs a screen the screener. In the key, she uses a capital T shape to denote the direction a player is facing in the play. Contemporarily, the T notation is used to denote a screen. More research is needed to trace the screen notation, but what's fascinating to me is Crichton's notation is the only one I've encountered at this time period that uses a T notation in tracing strategy and tracing plays. So without significantly more research, it's impossible to know if this notation was unique to Crichton, she just sort of did it, if she was copying it off the board, or if it was more widespread than I've encountered in other textbooks from this time. However, the presence of the T shape suggests a fruitful line for future research, and also suggests that we should be looking at things like class notes to talk about how were plays conceptualized and strategized in a particular time period. Perhaps the most intriguing information gleaned from the notes from my perspective are indicators about connections between the repertoire of basketball and other embodied practices. Popularized in the early 20th century in the United Kingdom, netball emerged from the modified rules of women's basketball. The small body of work that examines netball frequently focuses on the development of the rules and its spread in the Commonwealth. Very little of this work focuses on the relationship between embodied practices of netball and basketball, however, and virtually none of this work examines netball in a Canadian context. Netball wasn't seriously introduced in Canada until the 1960s, and there's every reason to believe that some of the embodied practices of netball were sport-specific, having developed really strongly in countries like Australia and New Zealand. However, the Margaret Eaton archive suggests that the practice of basketball in Canada should also be examined as a potential cross-pollinator of netball technique in Canada. Again, Crichton's notes regarding defensive stance provide one such example. So again, this is sort of, I've copied the notes there. Crichton's notes only vaguely describe basketball defensive stance in the early 21st century. So her description is where positions 1 takes to get started, you fake and you have one foot in front of the other and your balance maintains over your core, whereas basketball position, your balance is even and back weighted and you're horizontally balanced. So it's actually a pretty different description. The notes do, however, closely resemble netball defensive position. So this remains the technique for netball defense to this day. This suggests to me that it is not only worth examining the relationship between the rules of basketball and netball, but also between embodied practices of the two sports to investigate how the two may or may not be connected to one another, both in the past and through to the present day. To conclude then, Diana Taylor suggests that the documents of the archive frequently overdetermine the writing and studying of history in a range of fields from performance studies and theater to sport. I mostly say sport, she mostly says performance and theater. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there has been a conscious effort to include more of the repertoire in the writing of sport history in the last 20 years. The archive is still the major source for much historical writing. For the writing of women's sport history, this has two intersecting consequences. First, it tends to emphasize a narrative of women's sport history that focuses on rule and policy developments, rather than the embodied practices of the sports themselves. In the case of basketball, for example, as I pointed out earlier, it's easy to find out when the rule change about vertical plane happened in 1932, and it is much more difficult to find out when defensive stance became defensive stance. This means, by consequence, that the embodied experience of participating in sports is often omitted or under-theorized. Second, sport history in Canada and elsewhere is frequently constructed using the content of the archive, and specifically official documents such as policies, published books, and newspaper articles. Women's experiences, however, may not have been as actively recorded in these official forms of documentation. As such, women's experiences, embodied, emotional, intellectual, are frequently marginalized in sport history. Of course, the Margaret Eaton archive is an archive. One of the features that makes it significant, however, is that the archival documents found in the MES illuminate information, often unparalleled in their granular detail, regarding women's embodied practices. And of course, basketball is only one of the many sports that's covered. Everything from archery and golf and dance and gymnastics is covered in the archive. As such, the Margaret Eaton archive is an essential resource and supplement to existing histories of women's physical culture and sport in Canada. Thank you.
I think for offense, you probably prefer the fast break here.
Yes, I prefer to be having the ball as close to the basket as possible.
Yeah, we have about 7 minutes to just some questions to either Kelsey or Tricia. Would there be, you can come up or you can stay there, whatever is easiest for you. But any questions for either speaker? Just incidentally, it would be not very nice for Emma to hear this, but the current, where the temple used to be, is sort of half of it is a pizza store, and the other half is a high rise. But,
Yeah, I do. First of all, those were both, I know nothing about basketball, and that was so interesting.
Yeah, it was.
I can start with a question for Patricia, because, so, I mean, I think we often think that the sort of the paradigms that the first phase of the Margaret Eaton School kind of stopped in 1925, and then everything changes. And I'm just interested in whether, from your understanding of how the physical training and dance training happens in the later incarnation of the school, how much, I know rhythmics is being taught and so on. Does Delsartism or Delsartist practices, do they continue into the school between kind of 1925 and 1941 in some ways? Because, you know, the expressive arts seem to have been kind of locked off largely. So is there residual Delsartism in the physical training program? I'd be fascinated to know.
That's a really good question. And it's a much bigger question, perhaps, than you intended to make, because, in fact, Delsartian techniques are the ones that are, you might call it affecting, you might call it infecting, yoga, all of the many therapeutic practices. What you saw was an increasing focus on what one might call therapeutic practices, PT, OT, those kinds of arenas in physical education. And Delsart faded away as being seen as a late 19th, early 20th century technique, but in fact, it's all about breathing. Breathing, in fact, is the basis, and you know, the embodiment is the basis of all of our movements in sports. So it's seeped in different ways in the kinds of activities that we taught. I was going to ask Kelsey about this notion of pollination, which is partly related to your question, because in the next Journal of Sport History, I have an article coming out about Movement Education Comes to Canada, where I traced through archives in England female physical educators being hired from England because there weren't enough here, because the Margaret Eaton School couldn't be hired. So they were brought over from England, and they taught their approaches to movement education, which had its basis as well in Delsartian techniques, but was changed in many respects because of issues around fitness, issues around equipment, issues around safety. So that's a huge and interesting question you ask that you can answer in numerous ways. Did these women, female physical educators, they brought netball.
Because they would have gone to
They brought netball here, and the Canadian female physical educators were taken off to England, to Bedford College, to have some, and brought it back. And that, and it's pollinated, I love that idea, it pollinated the different sports, and you can trace it with embodied practices. We need much more work on this. Yeah, interesting question.
Other questions? Yeah, you?
Technical question. Kelsey, was the two-handed set shot also standard for men?
It was. So the most interesting to me about the development of embodied practice of basketball is that women actually shoot a one-handed push shot 40 years before men do, because it's mandated in modified rules. And so you have a moment of development in the genealogy, and so at this exact time, you're also seeing, so there's an entire book written on the development of the men's jump shot that's coming in the 1930s and 1940s. And so, but we never talk about the fact that women, by necessity, were shooting a one-handed push shot, which must have been influencing the repertoire of men, because they would have seen each other. So you're in the 1930s, so to answer your question, yes. So you have multiple kinds of shots happening at this time. Hook shots, what will become a layup is developing, and you can see it in the notes, and then one-handed push shots, and two-handed shots were still used in the men's game at this time. But it was a moment of transition towards the one-handed push shot and towards the jump spot shot specifically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other questions? I was just kind of sitting back, like having a nice glass of wine, just enjoying both your presentations and the delightful passion and experience you gave to it. So thank you both very much. So thank you. We have about 15 minutes till our next session. So again, just take time to touch base with each other, ask questions, look at the archives, enjoy some coffee and treats and things.